Jackson. Crusher. Dalton was a towering man with a rugged, intimidating presence. He wore a worn-out leather jacket, had a thick, unkempt beard, and carried a smirk that always seemed to challenge the world. Among his biker gang, he was more than just their leader. He was their legend, the one who came up with the boldest dares, the wildest challenges, and the best ways to prove they were the toughest riders on the road. That day, Jackson and his gang tore into a small, quiet town nestled in the heart of the American West. The afternoon sun bathed the dusty streets in a golden glow, and the wooden storefronts gave the place an old-fashioned charm. It was the kind of town where nothing much happened. The perfect kind of place for them to shake things up a bit. Engines thundered as their motorcycles rolled to a stop in front of a charming little cafe, drawing every eye in the vicinity. This town wasn't used to outsiders, let alone a gang of rude-looking bikers. A few townsfolk sitting on the cafe's porch quickly averted their eyes, silently hoping the newcomers would simply move along. But Jackson had no intention of passing through. He liked the attention. He liked the way people tensed up when he arrived. The thrill it fueled him. Jackson let out a loud, booming laugh, making it clear that he owned this moment. But then something caught his eye. Near the cafe entrance, two dogs sat calmly, completely unbothered by the roaring engines and commotion. They were well-groomed, their coats gleaming under the sunlight. One was a golden retriever with warm, kind eyes. The other, a sleek black and tan Doberman, sat in perfect posture, its muscles coiled with quiet strength. They exuded confidence and composure, unshaken by the chows around them. Jackson squinted, then sneered. He nudged one of his gang members and chuckled. "Look at these spoiled little pets," he scoffed. "I bet they've got a better life than we do." His gang erupted into laughter. Jackson always knew how to get a reaction, how to keep everyone entertained. And he figured it'd be amusing to mess with the dogs, just to see what they'd do. Without a second thought, he lifted his heavy boot and gave the golden retriever a light kick to the side. Not hard enough to hurt, but just enough to startle it. The retriever let out a startled yelp and jumped back, its once trusting eyes now filled with confusion and fear. The Doberman, however, wreaked it instantly. It didn't bark, it didn't growl, but its dark, piercing eyes locked onto Jackson, and its body tense with precise, controlled energy. A well-trained protector, one that knew exactly when to strike. For a split second everything froze. Inside the cafe, people held their breath. A waitress dropped her tray, the sharp crash of glass shattering the tense silence. A child holding an ice cream cone clenched it so tightly that the scoop fell onto the wooden deck with a soft plop. All eyes were on Jackson. The entire town had just witnessed what he had done. Jackson threw his head back and laughed, clearly pleased with himself. His gang laughed too, but this time, there was hesitation. Some of them weren't sure if they should. One of them muttered, "This might not be a good idea." Jackson burst into laughter, utterly pleased with his little prank. But this time, the laughter from his gang was hesitant. One of the bikers standing nearby muttered, I don't think this was a good idea." Jackson didn't care. It was just a dog, right? Just a harmless joke. But what Jackson didn't know, what none of his gang realized, was that those two dogs belonged to a man they should have never crossed. And that man had just witnessed everything from inside the cafe. Inside, at a small table near the window, a man sat quietly. His face was chiseled and strong, the kind of face that rarely revealed emotion. But his eyes, they told a different story. Nathan Steele was enjoying a black coffee, savoring the peaceful stillness of this quiet little town. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the glass, casting a soft golden hue on the wooden floors. Everything was calm, almost perfect, until he heard the sharp, startled yelp of his dog, the hand holding his coffee cup paused midair. His sharp, cold eyes shifted toward the window. He saw his golden retriever stepping back, confused and afraid, his Doberman standing tall, alert, ready to react. And then, his gaze locked onto the man responsible. The biker stood there, grinning, acting as if nothing had happened. Nathan slowly placed his cup back onto its saucer, the soft clink of porcelain ringing through the quiet cafe. The air grew heavier. A storm was coming. The cafe owner, a kind-looking older man, had seen everything, too. His face turned pale as he realized what was about to happen. He quickly stepped toward Nathan and whispered, "Sir, I think that biker just made a very big mistake." Nathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply stood up slowly, calmly, in complete control. Nathan Steele wasn't the kind of man who needed to shout. He didn't need to make a scene. His presence alone was enough to command attention. As he moved toward the door, the people in the cafe exchanged uneasy glances. They knew he was. They had heard the stories. Stories of relentless training. Stories of real-world combat. Stories of a man who had mastered discipline and destruction. Years of relentless training. Mastery of combat. Discipline forged in steel. The man walking out of that cafe was no ordinary man. He was a warrior. Outside, the bikers were still laughing, but their laughter had started to fade. Something wasn't right. The way the townspeople reacted, not just with fear, but with quiet anticipation, sent a ripple of unease through the gang. A younger biker nudged Jackson and whispered, "Oh, maybe we should just leave." Jackson frowned. Leave? For what? It was just a joke. But then, the air shifted. A shadow moved across the pavement. A tall figure stepped out of the cafe, each step slow and deliberate against the wooden planks. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silence. Nathan Steele stepped into the sunlight, his eyes locked onto Jackson. Focused. But beneath that stillness, there was something else. Something dangerous. For the first time that Jackson felt something unfamiliar. A feeling he rarely experienced unease. He had been in countless fights before. But there was something different about this man, the way he walked. The way he wasn't in a hurry. The way he didn't need to prove anything. Jackson folded his arms, trying to maintain his confidence. But his smirk wasn't as steady as before. Nathan Steele didn't rush. He didn't yell. He didn't make threats. He didn't need to. With each slow, powerful step, with eyes sharp as a lion hunting its prey, Nathan delivered a message. Loud and clear. He wasn't just angry. He was about to teach Jackson a lesson he would never forget. The entire town held its breath. People who had been distracted just moments ago were now fully locked in, their eyes fixed on what was unfolding. Some gripped their chair arms. Others forgot to blink. The cafe owner stepped outside but stayed near the doorway. Like a man who wanted to witness what was about to happen but also needed an escape route, in case things spiraled out of control. Nathan stopped, just a few steps away from Jackson. He looked him over from head to toe. A slow, deliberate evaluation. Cold, calculated. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need words. All he needed was that stare. Storm was gathering, ready to explode at any moment. Jackson kept his arms crossed, trying to look tough in front of his gang. But something had shifted. His shoulders tensed. His stance wasn't as steady. He could feel the pressure. Nathan finally spoke. "You kicked my dog." But his voice was calm, but heavy like distant thunder warning of an approaching storm. Jackson scoffed, rolling his eyes and shrugging. "It was just a little tap, man. Relax." He forced out a chuckle, and his gang joined in. But their laughter had lost its edge. Nathan didn't blink. He didn't move. "You think that's funny?" His voice stayed ice cold. Jackson shrugged again, but this time, the movement wasn't as smooth. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just messing around." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and that's when it hit him. The entire town was watching him. His gang was still behind him, but for the first time in his life, Jackson felt completely alone. Nathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering Jackson's words. Slowly, deliberately, he took a single step forward. Jackson swallowed hard. Nathan's eyes weren't filled with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. There was only a quiet, simmering energy. Like a storm, seconds away from unleashing its fury. The entire town held its breath. eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Nathan Steele didn't yell. He didn't show off. He simply stared at Jackson with a calm, razor-sharp intensity. "You want to have fun?" Nathan's voice was barely above a whisper. "All right, let's have some fun." Before Jackson reacted, Nathan moved. Fast. Too fast. 1 second, Jax was standing tall, full of arrogance. The next, he was stumbling, completely off balance. Nathan didn't even need to throw a punch. He only needed one precise movement, a small, effortless sweep to the exact weak point in Jackson's stance. And that was all it took. Jackson crashed to the ground, his back slamming hard against the dirt road with a loud thud. The gang's jaws dropped. Their leader, their toughest, most fearless alpha, was now lying in the dust, blinking in stunned disbelief. Nathan didn't smile. He just stood there, looking down at Jackson with the same calm, unreadable expression. "Not so funny now, is it?" Nathan's voice was quiet, but each word cut straight through Jackson's pride, like a blade. Jackson scrambled to his feet, his face burning red with humiliation. His gang stood frozen. Not one of them dared to step forward. They weren't sure if they should. And the townspeople, they held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jackson clenched his fists, trying to shake off the shock. He had been in countless fights before. He couldn't let some random guy humiliate him like this. Straightening his jacket, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, his eyes burning with rage. But there was something he didn't notice. The townspeople had started smiling. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't looking at Jackson as some dangerous man. They were watching a show, and they already knew how it was going to end. Nathan Steele didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't read to. Jackson could yell. He could glare. He could try to salvage his pride. But none of it mattered. Deep down, Jackson knew one thing. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Nathan remained calm. No urgency. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his fists. He just stood there. Jackson gritted his teeth, his body burning with humiliation. With a furious roar, he lunged forward, throwing a full-force punch straight at Nathan's face. But Nathan had already seen it coming. He moved fast, precise, as if he had known exactly what was about to happen. He sidestepped effortlessly, gliding past Jackson like a panther avoiding a clumsy predator. Before Jackson even realized what had happened, Nathan caught his wrist. A simple, controlled twist right at the weak point. And just like that, Jackson's punch fell apart. Then with one smooth motion, Nathan redirected the force of Jackson's own attack. Jackson's momentum turned against him. Nathan gave the slightest pull, and Jackson stumbled forward, completely off balance. Boom! Jackson crashed into a wooden table, his massive frame slamming through it, shattering chairs and sending plates, cups, and silverware flying in every direction. A deafening thud echoed through the air. Then absolute silence. The entire town stood frozen. The biker gang's eyes widened in shock. Not a single one of them moved. Barely the man they had always thought was untouchable was now lying on the ground, groaning in pain, buried in the wreckage. The cafe owner winced at the mess. But he didn't say a word. Jackson staggered, struggling to push himself up. But before he could get to his feet, Nathan Steele was already standing over him. Still calm, still unshaken, immovable. Nathan didn't need to threaten him. He simply tilted his head slightly, his cold gaze laced with quiet amusement. Still having fun. Jackson gritted his teeth, fighting through the pain as he stumbled upright. He couldn't back down. Not in front of his crew. Not in front of the entire town. His pride wouldn't allow it. With a desperate roar, Jackson charged straight at Nathan, hoping, praying he could catch him off guard this time. But Nathan didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't step back. He had seen this exact moment 100 times before, and every time it ended the same way. With a single, effortless move, smooth, precise, Nathan stepped forward, to ask. A lightning-fast, pinpoint strike straight to Jackson's chest. Not enough to break anything, but more than enough to drive every last breath from his lungs. Jackson froze mid-charge. His entire body recoiled, stumbling backward, his mouth gaping as he struggled to pull in air. His chest burned. His legs trembled. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless in a fight. And his gang knew it. A few of them took slow steps backward. Some turned away, unable to meet Nathan's gaze. They had come to this town looking for trouble. But now all they wanted was to get out. The townspeople, they were laughing. No longer afraid. No longer worried, only enjoying the moment, watching justice unfold. Nathan took another step forward. Jackson was still gasping for air, struggling to recover. Nathan didn't need to yell. He didn't need to do anything more. Because Jackson already understood, he had lost. Down in the part of himself he refused to acknowledge. He knew the truth. He was no longer the strongest man here. Nathan Steele wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. Nathan simply looked at Jackson, his expression as calm as ever, and said, "You kicked my dog. Now you know how that feels." The Jackson's heart pounded. For the first time that day, he didn't just feel humiliated. He felt real fear. He took a shaky breath, trying to pull himself together. But his chest still ached. His breathing was still heavy, and worst of all, he had no idea what had just happened. How could this even be possible? He had been in hundreds of fights before, but this was something completely different. Nathan Steele wasn't just strong. He was fast, precise, and completely in control. Jackson's gang was still there, but not one of them moved. They had ridden into this town, believing they were the toughest men around. But now, they weren't so sure. They had just watched Nathan dismantle Jackson with almost no effort. No rush, no struggle, and that terrified them more than any punch ever could. Jackson wiped his face, trying to regain some confidence. He was still the leader. He couldn't let his gang see him like this. His pride wouldn't allow it. But then, it was over in an instant. In a desperate move, Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife. The way he gripped it shaky, uncertain him away. Panicked with a flick, the blade snapped open. He held it in front of him, his breathing heavy, his eyes filled with both determination and fear. The entire town gasped. People stepped back. A few began murmuring in hushed tones. Some glanced at Nathan, wondering, would he back down now? Now that a real weapon had entered the fight. But Nathan Steele didn't even blink. He simply let out a sigh, like a man who was tired of this. Then he shook his head, his voice as calm as still water in a light breeze. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Jackson clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the fear creeping through him. He didn't care if Nathan was some kind of action star, or a trained fighter. He could back down now. Not in front of his crew. Not with everyone watching. He had to do something. And so he lunged. Fast, the blade glinted under the sunlight, aimed straight for Nathan's side. But then, Nathan moved before Jackson could even complete his attack. A movement too fast for the eye to track. His hand shot out. Up Jackson didn't dare move. Nathan Steele ended the fight with a single motion. Before Jackson even realized what had happened, his wrist was locked in an iron grip. A slight twist wrist controlled. Clang. The knife hit the ground, the metallic sound echoing through the silent street. Jackson's mouth fell open, his breath coming in short gasps. His wrist burned. His knees nearly buckled from the sudden pressure. Nathan tightened his grip just a little. Not enough to break. Not enough to truly hurt, but enough to make Jackson understand one simple fact. He was completely powerless. And for the first time in his life, he knew it. The entire street was dead silent. The gang, once so sure of their dominance, was no longer confident. They had just watched Nathan dismantle Jackson, effortlessly. No rush, struggle, and that terrified them more than any punch ever could. Jackson wiped his face, trying to salvage some shred of confidence. He was still the leader. He couldn't let his gang see him like this. His pride wouldn't allow it. But then, it was over in an instant. In a final act of desperation, Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife. The way he gripped it, shaky, uncertain, betrayed his panic. With a flick, the blade snapped open. He held it up in front of him, his breath heavy, his eyes filled with both determination and fear. The entire town gasped. People stepped back, some whispering among themselves. A few even glanced at Nathan, wondering, would he back down now? Now that a real weapon was in play. But Nathan Steele didn't even blink. He simply let out a sigh, like a man who was tired of this. Then he shook his head, his voice calm, steady like still water in a light breeze. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Jackson clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore the fear creeping through him. The biker gang stood frozen, not saying a word. The townspeople watched, some wide-eyed in shock, others smiling ever so slightly, as if they had seen this coming all along. Nathan leaned in just a little, his voice low but razor sharp. That's what it feels like to be powerless. Then, he paused, holding Jackson in his piercing gaze. And now imagine how my dog felt. But Jackson didn't speak. He couldn't. He was too busy trying not to shake. Nathan held his gaze for a moment longer. Long enough to make sure Jackson had fully understood the lesson. Then he let go of his wrist, stepped back. The knife still lay on the ground, glinting under the sunlight. But Jackson didn't dare pick it up. Now, he was paying the price. For the first time in his life, Jackson didn't want to fight anymore. He stood frozen, his entire body stiff, his wrist still throbbing from Nathan's grip. His breath came in shallow gasps. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Today wasn't supposed to go like this. He and his gang had rolled into town looking for fun, to show off, to prove they were the toughest men around. Now he was the one being humiliated, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. The knife still lay there, between them. But Jackson wouldn't touch it. He could still feel the strength in Nathan's grip, the absolute control in every movement. This wasn't a fight he could win. His crew, the same guys who had laughed and cheered him on, were now watching him with uncertain eyes. Their invincible leader had been taken down. Not but twice. And now Jackson stood there frozen, sure of what to do next. Nathan hadn't moved. He didn't need to. His message had been loud and clear. He had given Jackson a chance to walk away, but Jackson had pushed things too far. And now, he had received a lesson he would never forget. The gang's motorcycles stood in a row, the same gang that had ridden in so arrogantly, believing they were the toughest men around. Now they just wanted to leave fast. Because the entire town had seen the truth. Jackson wasn't as tough as he thought. He wasn't the scariest man here. And then, the golden retriever, the very dog Jackson had kicked, calmly walked up to Nathan's side. It sat down, steady, confident. It looked at its owner. And after a moment, it turned its gaze toward Jackson. Its eyes, calm, intelligent, seemed to say exactly what everyone was thinking. Justice had been served. Jackson swallowed hard. The silence around him was suffocating. His pride screamed at him to do something. To fight. To prove he wasn't weak. But this time, a different voice inside him spoke louder. The voice that knew when to walk away, and for the first time in his life, Jackson listened. He took a step back. Then another. His hands trembled. He tried to hide it, but everyone saw. Let's go. Jackson's voice was barely more than a whisper. He didn't dare look at his gang. They hesitated, unsure if they should follow. They waited for something. But then, they saw it. Jackson would meet Nathan's eyes. And in that moment, they understood. Their leader had surrendered. One by one, they backed away toward their bikes. From a distance, the town slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The people, Those who had once held their breath began to relax. Some whispered to each other, still in disbelief over what they had just witnessed. Others simply smiled, satisfied. Jackson didn't look back. He moved quickly toward his bike, not even bothering to pick up the knife that had fallen to the ground. He just wanted to get out of there fast, but just as he reached for the ignition, Nathan spoke. His voice was steady, calm, but filled with undeniable authority. The next time that Jackson froze, to think twice before trying to prove how tough you are. Jackson clenched his jaw, but he didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The engines roared to life, echoing down the street, but this time it didn't sound powerful. It sounded like defeat. The motorcycles disappeared into the distance, leaving behind the small town, and the man who had made them bow their heads. Jackson knew one thing for certain. He would never forget this day. Nathan let out a quiet chuckle, giving a casual shrug. Just a little discipline. And with that, the bikers were gone. The town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People began to smile, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Nathan with admiration. Others simply nodded, as if they had known all along that this was how it would end. The cafe owner stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron before letting out a chuckle. Not a bad show, he said, clearly amused. Nathan, still watching the bikers disappear down the road, finally turned back toward the cafe. He knelt down, gently running his hand over the head of his golden retriever. The dog wagged its tail, content, safe. The Doberman, however, remained perfectly still, its sharp eyes still locked on the road. As if making sure the troublemakers would not return, Nerby, an elderly woman, her kind eyes full of wisdom, stepped forward with a warm smile. "See, that was incredible," she said. "You barely had to do anything, and still taught him a lesson he'll never forget." And Nathan gave a small nod, a faint smirk appearing at the corner of his lips. Then he reached for his coffee, lifted the cup to his lips, and took a slow sip, and went right back to enjoying the quiet afternoon. Nathan glanced around at the small town, now peaceful once again. Then in a calm voice he said, "TT, people think strength is about showing off. But real strength is knowing when to use it. And when you don't have to." The cafe owner chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "I don't think they all be coming back." His expression was still one of disbelief. "And if they do, they'll think twice before causing trouble again." And Nathan didn't say a word. But the small smirk at the corner of Nathan's lips said it all. The golden retriever let a happy bark, almost as if it, too, could feel the relief in the air. From behind, a young boy, who had been hiding behind his mother, suddenly stepped forward. Cautiously, he reached out, gently running his fingers through the dog's soft fur. "Is your dog okay, mister?" He has big, curious eyes looking up at Nathan. Nathan knelt down, checking over the retriever one last time. Then he smiled, giving its floppy ears a gentle scratch. "Yeah, he's okay," Nathan said, his voice calm and steady. The boy's face lit up. "That's good. He's really cute." And Nathan chuckled softly. He stood up, brushed the dust off his hands, and took a glance around. Finally, he let out a relaxed breath. "All right," Nathan said, his voice easy and light. "Yeah, I think I could use another cup of coffee." The entire town burst into laughter. Life had returned to normal, but they all knew this was a day that no one in town, or in that biker gang, would ever forget. A story that would live on. The cafe owner let out a hearty laugh, clapping his hands against his apron. "This one is on the house. You've earned it." And Nathan gave a small nod, not arguing. He turned and walked calmly toward the cafe, his two loyal dogs following at his side. The townspeople watched him go, their eyes filled with admiration and quiet respect. They had just witnessed something they would talk about for years to come. A stranger had arrived in their town, not looking for trouble, not trying to prove anything, just a man who wanted to enjoy a peaceful afternoon with his dogs. But when trouble found him, he faced it, not with rage, not with meaningless violence, but with something far greater: calm, control, and unshakable strength. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the small town, everyone understood one thing for certain. Jackson and his gang had picked the wrong man to mess with. In the days that followed, life in the town returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The small shops were bustling again. The cafe remained the heart of the town, where locals stopped by for a cup of coffee or tea. But one thing never changed. People still told the story of that day, of the man who arrived in silence, and left with the respect of everyone. A lone traveler passing through, leaving no chows in his wake. Only a legend. People exchanged glances. They smiled. Jackson and his gang never came back. No one in town had seen them since that day, and no one wanted to. But the story of that day, that never faded. The cafe owner still chuckled whenever someone brought it up. "You've seen plenty of tough guys pass through this town," he would say, shaking his head with amusement. "But I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. No shouting, no senseless violence. And he didn't even break a sweat." And the little boy who had petted Nathan's dog, he never stopped telling the story, retelling ever and over again to his friends, his excitement never fading. And at the end, he moved so fast the biker didn't even know what hit him. The other kidsy eyes lit up, their voices bursting with excitement, as if they were hearing about a living legend. And maybe, in the hearts of the townspeople, Nathan Steele truly had become one. He'd come and gone like a passing storm. But the lesson he left behind, that would never be forgotten. One afternoon, the distant roar of a motorcycle echoed through the quiet streets. A few people instinctively looked up, a flicker of tension in their eyes. But this time, it wasn't Jackson, it wasn't his gang. Just a lone traveler riding through town, causing no trouble. The town remained peaceful. And they knew, from now on, it always would be, because there are people who should never be provoked. The lone traveler continues his journey, just like so many others who have passed through this small town. The cafe owner smiles and greets the new guest, as he always does. The people of the town have learned an important lesson. Not all bikers are troublemakers. And not everyone who is silent is weak. Some people carry within them a strength. A strength that doesn't need to be flaunted, unless truly necessary. As the sun dips below the horizon, the town resumes its rhythm. Small, peaceful, and safer than ever. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Nathan Steele and his loyal dogs are still on their journey. They leave no trace. Only a story that will be told and passed on for many years to come. But this is just one part of Nathan's journey. The roads ahead are still waiting for him. The troublemakers still don't know that. There are people who should never be challenged. Would you like to continue following these thrilling stories and deep lessons? Click subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories.